Greetings, my name is Martin, I'm a 3D artist outside of World of Warcraft and have been a Warlock Main for the past 2 seasons in the War Within, and I plan to stay one in the upcoming Midnight expansion. Today I want to take a closer look at the, in my opinion, top 5 tier sets of the Warlock class from a designer's point of view. These 5 sets aren't going to be ranked or sorted in any particular way, they're just the top 5. That I'm going to talk about a little bit. Before we're getting started, I want to talk for a second about the fact that a lot of people consider the Warlock class as being blessed with a lots of good tier sets compared to other classes. And in my opinion, this is true, and there's a good reason for it. This is because Warlock has a somewhat coherent vibe as a class, and this was never really changed a whole lot ever since vanilla. Warlocks are the most evil, good guys, there's going to be fel magic, there can be skulls, chains, demonic stuff, and it will always work with all 3 specs as well as all the new hero specs, at least reasonably well. There are classes like Mage, Death Knight or Priest where this is way harder to achieve from a designer's point of view, because you have to try covering the Frost and Fire Mage class fantasy in a single design, or Holy and Shadow, or Blood, Frost and Unholy. These are big challenges for a designer, which makes it all the more impressive when it is achieved, but also often leads to class sets that feel very odd for a certain specialization, while they work perfectly for another. And we're not even getting started with races. With this being said, this is the Eye of Kilrock. Let's look into that. Alright, let's get started with one that's definitely a classic, even though I'm having a bit of a hard time with this one. I think it is an amazing set that fits the class fantasy perfectly, because it was created for, I would say, the most well-known representative of the Warlock class, Gul'dan. We're obviously talking about the Shadow Council's Garb from Mythic Blackrock Foundry. Tier 17, Heroic and Normal version are actually also pretty good sets, but I don't think you can make a video about the top Warlock sets of all time without including the Gul'dan cosplay. What makes this set so good in my opinion is the blend of a fairly simple base shape, which is then layered and elevated by adding very unique elements as well as lighting effects. Of course, it's also an older set, so we'll have to put a little bit of imagination into it. Looking at these chains here, for instance, if these weren't just textured and old school textured, in addition to that, the set would have way more depth. But let's go with the shoulders, which are obviously the main piece of this set. The aim is clearly to already create this rather distinct visual with very sharp edges, which is a good way if you're trying to convey a certain level of aggression. This base shape is then simply duplicated and tapered down for the outer bit. Here it is not very sharp but more rounded and tilted downwards. What this does is actually accentuate the next layer, which again is almost the same shape as the initial piece, tapered down, and now with this point going up and out. And then pretty much the same game again with an even more simplified shape to top it all. What this gives us overall is a very interesting layered silhouette. But what's also very important for a WoW character, the very typical V-taper, as you're trying to also achieve it in body composition as a hallmark of a strong and healthy human, especially of the male variety. This is also a very prevalent design feature that you find in almost all armor sets in World of Warcraft. Now, in addition to this base shape, we now also have these broken off horns with skulls that are mended to the back of the armor. Now, in a practical sense, that would obviously be an absolute pain to deal with, but the idea is clearly to have these added symbolically to give off the full-on Gul'dan vibe. Even though these horns were actually coming from Gul'dan's own back, as he became something of a demon himself when pledging his soul to the Legion, on top of that, the added horns are also very reminiscent of the Warlock Tier 5 back in the Burning Crusade. At this point, I want to mention another set as my first honorable mention today, because while it follows a very different design philosophy, it shares the common trait of the Gul'dan set in that sense that it is also firstly a character set and only in its second stage a class set. I'm talking about Tier 8 from Ulduar, the Deathbringer Garb, which was first seen as the armor on Grand Apothecary Putris in the legendary Wrathgate cinematic. The set is also super interesting with the mix of feathers, bones and bird skulls, as well as the fairly obvious and very fitting Plague Doctor visual as a template for Putris. This design feature was actually picked up again on several occasions over time, like the Castle Nathria set in Shadowlands. At number 2, I have a set I featured plenty on this channel already, but I'm just absolutely in love with it and can't wait to add it to my collection, the Season 1 Midnight set, becoming a frickin' infernal. Let's take a closer look today. This armor set displays pure power that's only barely held under control. We have this fel-infused rock that's in the process of cracking and held in place with metal pieces and chains. And while at first I think the shoulders, simply because of their size, is where this is most notable, it's actually most advanced when you're looking at the head. The skull seems to be about to be splitting open, the eyes are burning, and everything below that is already covered with a metal mask. Now, we had our fair share of cool masks in the game, not only on Warlock sets, but what I find especially interesting with this headpiece is that it's not really a helmet, it's a head replacement. We've also had that before, but in this case, having this fel rock skull that's kind of clamped together with this mask and the pieces on top of the head, it reminds me a little bit of the unmasked Darth Vader, but if Darth Vader was an actual demon. And then on the shoulders we have these massive metal chains that are clearly keeping the rocks from moving outwards or splitting open even more, which is again designed in a very interesting way because these chains aren't actually attached to anything. If we look down, it actually gives off the impression that the chains are already broken off from the belt, where two pieces of chain just loosely hang down. When I looked at this the first time, I thought the chains were clipping through the fabric, but they are not. They are broken. We also have this one bit on the outside that's floating upwards, which is also already loose, and that bit is even animated that way, and it becomes even better when the mythic effect is added, where the flames are kind of pulsing and moving across the entire model of the head and shoulders. So I initially wanted to say that this set is on the edge of whatever, exploding, transforming into an infernal, reversing the power and just crushing the warlock. It just works beautifully with the whole idea that warlocks are these unique mages that do live on the absolute edge of what's possible. And over time we've seen plenty of quests in which warlocks went a step too far and just got evaporated. This set is actually already past that point. The chains are already broken. At this point it seems like it is held together exclusively by the unrelenting will of the warlock. Or maybe the other piece of the set we haven't really talked about yet, the belt. It has this round fel stone at the center, which is locked into metal. This might be like the core of the infernal. And here it's also very clear that this stone probably doesn't want to be there, as the shape around it is a lock. But not the kind of lock that's supposed to be ever opened again. It is bolted shut on top of it. So maybe this set was also some sort of contraption before it became an armor, with the chains to hold these pieces of infernal in place in order to lock up the core and subjugate it this way. The name of the set is another hint into that direction, as it is called Reign of the Abyssal Immolator. So as a matter of fact, me constantly calling the set the Infernal set is actually even downplaying it, as the Abyssals like Supremus in Black Temple are an even more powerful and bigger version of the Infernals. And sacrificing demons for our own power is something we constantly do as warlocks in the game. May it be tons of imps as demonology warlocks, or the active pet as a destruction or affliction warlock with the grimoire. Going for the immolation of an entire abyssal, however, that's next level warlock stuff, and to be entirely honest, this kind of thing should have been the Order Hall armor with a big connected questline back in Legion. But this being said, I'm glad we have it now. Long may we reign. Oh, and a little last design note. Mixing in those raw geometrical shapes of the spikes that connect the chains works very well to bring a little bit of visual order into the mix of these somewhat organic visually, because they're mobile chains and the rocks. So that's another little detail I did want to mention about the set before we move on to number 3, Tier 5, the Corruptor Raiment. Coming from the Serpent Shrine and the Eye all the way back in TBC. I've already briefly mentioned it as the predecessor design of Gul'dan's armor, but of course it's way more than just that. In my opinion, one of the most memorable and coolest Warlock set designs to this day, and little spoiler, the oldest on my list today. It obviously has all the black metal spikes in the world with skulls and red shining eyes put on them, but the set also was the first one to introduce chain elements to the Warlock style, as we've also seen it featured in our latest set and many in between. We've also seen the kind of magical power cores introduced, which made a return in the first raid tier of Legion, for instance. Black and red are obviously colors that always work well together when it comes to displaying a somewhat evil character. At the risk of unveiling who is the perfect depiction of an evil character in my opinion, just think about Darth Vader. Black armor, red lightsaber, Warlock Tier 5, black armor, red magic, spikes, chains. The set is also one that received a fitting sword with it, the Tempest of Chaos. And it is time for the second honorable mention of the day. Following after Tier 5 came Tier 6, and while I was never a big fan of the overall design or the color scheme of the set, it came with the coolest feature at the time and one of the coolest features to this day, the wings. Which then made several comebacks with the challenge mode set in Mists of Pandaria and then in Legion as part of the class order hole set for the Warlock. And of course the Tier 6 remake, Tier 20 from the Tomb of Sargeras. And while I'm still not a big fan of the set in general, there is another Legion set, which was my favorite until we've seen the Midnight set. I've also talked about my love for this set before on this channel. It's number 4, it's Tier 21, the Grim Inquisitor's Regalia from Antorus, the Burning Throne. What I find so fascinating about this set is how kind of small the difference between the regular and the mythic version really is, but how drastic the difference in vibe. Now, the mask with this grinning skull is obviously always fairly unique and the core feature of the set. But if you're looking at the rest of the set, it's extremely tame, especially for a Warlock. Like, without the headpiece and the lighting, this could be some questing armor. 2 layers of plate on the shoulder, fairly basic shapes, a couple of spikes, a fairly basic robe, and if we're looking at the overall silhouette, this is actually an A-taper in many cases, depending on the race you pick, with the sleeves being wider than the shoulders. This is extremely understated and almost unheroic. It actually goes very well with the more broken, creepy vibe that you may get from an undead character. And then we switch to the mythic version and really just add 2 bits to the set. The piece on the gloves is actually not very relevant. If anything, it somewhat ruins the overall shape on a couple of races like human, where it still pushes out and keeps the model in this A shape, even though substantially reduced, but instead let's look at the proper heroic V-taper as we can see it on the Blood Elf now. It's also not only the shape, it's also the weight, visually. I mean, from the looks of it, also physically, but with having more going on so far up on the model, it automatically gives off the impression that this is where it's at. In a sense, we have to look up to the character, even above the shoulder line, even above the head, to look at the top spikes of the new shoulder piece. And that's kind of how humans are conditioned. It's why thrones exist, or stages and balconies to speak from for royalty. Now, obviously also in order to be seen by anyone, but this kind of hits the same spot. There wouldn't be a reason to make sure you are seen and looked up to if you weren't important. And just in case you didn't get the subtle hint, the designers made sure that you are aware that you are looking at a king by also adding a crown to the already insane headpiece. I think the added pieces themselves are supposed to act as stylized wings, which is also very typical ever since tier 6, but then also in the metamorphosis arc of the demonology warlock from Cataclysm until Legion, making the warlock himself a bit more of a demon. But why I really love this set and why I also love to talk about it from a design perspective is because it shows how much you can achieve with fairly subtle changes. You wouldn't even have to go for those massive wings to completely switch the visual language of this set. They obviously are amazing and work great, but if you would have simply drawn out the shoulders a little more to move away from the A-taper and put whatever on there, even if it's just 2 taller spikes or some more lighting that draws your view upwards a little bit, this would have already done the trick. And at the end of the day, I also really like this Legion approach of designing these sets for different raid difficulties. Nowadays it's only the colorways, and as everyone has access to the mythic visuals, this is in line with the every piece of gear is just transmog philosophy. But this kind of transformation of a set from regular raiding to mythic really visualizes the difference in achievement, in my opinion. But I don't want to get into that topic today, as I'm actually working on another video talking just about that. And before we take a closer look at our last set for the day, it's also time for the final honorable mention, Tier 1. I don't think we can look at the best Warlock tier sets if we don't at least briefly look at where it all started. And compared to the other tier 1 sets, the Warlock got a great set from the get-go, and plenty of those typical details we've seen on repeat were already around. The big spikes towards the back of the set have come back so many times. Even the very first Warlock set already introduced the concept of body modification instead of just armor by giving the Warlock demonic horns. We obviously have plenty of skulls. That was always a no-brainer, quite literally, actually. The only thing I always questioned, and I'm sorry if you've never noticed this and now can't unsee it, is the cute little rabbit on the shoulder plate. Look at him, so cute. And last but not least, number 5, Amirdrasil, the devout Ash Devil's Pact Weave. Now, first of all, I've been googling Ash Devil, if that's some sort of demon type or refers to any specific character, and I wasn't able to find anything. And I also don't really get much of an ash or fire or anything of the likes vibe from the set itself. This being said, as it is from Amirdrasil, it may really just refer to the theme of the raid itself. Now, for the design, we have been talking more than a little bit about the heroic V-taper as a key to the silhouette here and there. Well, look at this one. If it weren't for the crazy claw-like blades on the gloves, it would be even more of a V. Like, that wouldn't even be a V anymore, more like a 90-degree angle. Of course, we also find all of our favorite Warlock details again. So we have the skull mask with horns, we have the skull belt buckle, plenty of spikes and horns. And what makes me wonder a little bit, these horns on the shoulders are shockingly reminiscent of the big boy Nerubians we encountered plenty in the War Within. So this set is another one of those where I wonder, does the design team at Blizzard just pump out armor sets and then they roll dice on when to use them? I also like a lot how those runes look, as well as how the light effects work on all of the spikes that are spread across the set. The next thing I find fascinating is how amazing the plate details were made in this set. Interestingly, at this point of Dragonflight, the first, I call them plastic sets, started to show up for the plate wearers like Paladin and DK. Meanwhile, Warlock got the most amazing etched metal texture on his shoulder plates. Maybe also a little design choice to talk about for a second. Every once in a while I've heard complaints about armors like this because they include so much metal while they are sets for a cloth class. And while I somewhat agree when it comes to mage or priest, I always feel like the Warlock is a bit of an exception to this. Due to fell armor and mostly demon skin, Warlocks are by far the tankiest cloth class with the highest armor. And while the armor they have is magical, I don't feel that it is wrong to generally display this fact in some way in the Warlock tier sets. The alternative would obviously be to add some glowy armor stuff to really point out that it is magical, but I actually think having some actual plate on the Warlock works way better, and considering an armor shape like the one we have in front of us right now as magical actually makes way more sense than thinking that the Warlock just carries half a ton of steel around on his shoulders, with blades coming out on each side that make him almost as wide as he is tall. Now, obviously, we're not going to start any discussion about the realism of fantasy armor, especially not in WoW, but I feel like this can be a semi-reasonable explanation of how this can make sense that actually incorporates one of the key characteristics of the Warlock class. Now, before we come to an end, I want to spend another minute or two talking about why this set looks so incredibly coherent. Like, if you look at it, for the most part, it's just perfect. In my opinion, only the mask is a little bit weird from some angles, but let me draw you some lines. So, what you will find when you look at this armor set is that pretty much every line drawn will connect to another line, which somehow envelops the entire design, with only the shoulder knives and the horns breaking out of that. And even those point in a way which would probably connect them further out, which will then give you the ultimate overall shape of this set. So you see that the shoulder plates point towards the chest, which points towards the belt. You see that the blades on the arms point inwards towards the shoes, not to the outside to get lost somewhere. The horns on the shoulders connect to the horns on the head. The general inner shape of the shoulder plates create a frame for the headpiece. Even the textured spikes down here work in a way in which they create this invisible center line. And that's again just one of these ways the human brain works, whether you're aware of it or not. But your brain notices these lines, even if I don't draw them out for you. And often when something looks weird or off or just bad, this can be the issue. Of course, you can also play with this in other cases, if you want something to look out of place or to look random. But if you're going for a coherent design that people will view as such, this is how you do it. And you see how much is going on in this model. There is so much stuff, so many shapes, but it all looks coherent and good, because the person who designed it used this technique on purpose or just following their own feeling. But this is how that works. Now, this was our last set for the day. I know it was quite the excursion, and I hope you sticked around for the whole bit. Nonetheless, I personally always find this kind of stuff very interesting. Also to learn a couple of, let's say, trait sequence of traits I otherwise have nothing to do with. This is sometimes a bigger part of being a 3D artist as you may think. For instance, in order to create nice and realistic leather boots, I spent quite some time learning how actual leather boots are made, why certain seams are where they are, what parts you actually have, and this can be a very fascinating endeavor. So I hope even if you do not work in the field and just enjoy to look at a nice tier set in WoW every once in a while, this video was interesting to watch. If so, I'll make sure to put out more videos of this kind in the future. As always, leave a comment and let me know what you think. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing if you want to see more of this kind of stuff. This was the Eye of Kilrock. See you next time.